Zombie become a Unitarian Universalist. He was looking for a church with brains. Thank you for laughing at that. Then there's this one that a member of the church sent me this week. I know we've got a lot of math and science geeks in our congregation. I love you guys. Tonight is the season 6 premiere of the television show The Walking Dead, a show about a zombie apocalypse. And I wonder, do we have any fans of that show here? A few brave souls. I'm not surprised about you, Brenda. Yeah. It's a gory, scary show about a virus that causes people to die, and then it takes over and it reanimates a small part of their brains, turning the people into flesh-eating zombies. They then wander around the city and the country and the forests and everywhere because the virus sweeps across the whole country, looking for living people to bite and infect. Grisly. Civilization collapses as the majority of the population is infected. Hospitals and police and government and basically every inch of society are all overrun with zombies. Roving bands of survivors fight over the last of the food and medicine, often murdering each other, and even beloved characters can get killed off without warning. It's pretty great. And it's pretty disgusting. I am not necessarily recommending it to you. But the show has set records for cable TV ratings. Research shows it's most popular among 18 to 49-year-olds. And of course, fascination with zombies, and not only zombies, but ghosts and vampires and monsters and all that kind of stuff, is not a new thing at all. Not even a recent thing. The first horror movie was made in 1896 by a French filmmaker. It was called The Devil's Castle. 1896. That means that pretty much the instant motion pictures were invented, someone immediately made a scary one. And the genre has been strong ever since. We really like our zombies, monsters, and ghosts. And of course, before there were movies, there were other scary stories written or shared in oral traditions, like spooky campfire stories. That's where the ideas for the movies came from in the first place. The Devil's Castle is named after the devil, after all, one of the oldest scary characters of all. We like them because they make good stand-ins for reflecting on ethical and existential questions on some level. When I say existential, I mean questions about what our existence means. If you've ever had the feeling that we're just like a bunch of ants running around pointlessly as our lives go by, or if you've ever wondered what the point of it all is when we're ultimately helpless in a seemingly hostile universe, then you have had an existential question, if not an existential crisis. We've always played out our religious questions in dramas and in other forms of entertainment, and scary stories are one of the ways we do it, even though most of the time we don't think of those as spiritual things. Do you remember back in 2004 when Mel Gibson produced the movie Passion of the Christ? Yeah, it was a very graphic depiction of the crucifixion of Jesus, and it was controversial for its depiction of Jews as well, but it was #1 at the box office for quite a while. Well, my colleague Tom Belote points out that after several weeks at #1 at the box office, the movie that knocked it out of the #1 spot was none other than a remake of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. That's right, Tom says. A violent and gory film about rising from the dead and consuming flesh was beaten out at the box office by a zombie movie. That's one way to see it. We really do like our scary scenarios. Actually, it turns out that the US government likes scary stories too. Did you know that the Department of Defense has developed a plan to prevent a zombie apocalypse? I'm not kidding you. It's a little bit hard to see on this next slide, but this is the cover of it. It has a zombie on it, and it says Counter Zombie Dominance Plan. I'm serious. It came out in April 2011, less than 1 year after The Walking Dead premiered. Now, the Department of Defense has explained that they're not really afraid of zombies. They say they had to pick something impossible to use as the basis for thinking through a grand emergency response plan, because if they wrote up a fictitious plan about, say, Liechtenstein invading the US in a hostile takeover, then we'd probably have a bunch of Texans reading way too much into that. There'd be anti-Liechtensteiner rallies and people drawing caricatures of the Alps with their guns out. Things could get really out of hand. So they had to use the zombies. Well, whatever the case, this really got me thinking, could it be that, like the US Department of Defense, we could also use the zombie apocalypse as an exercise in spiritual disaster preparedness? Since zombies and other characters have a spiritual role to play, let's give it a try. Spiritual disaster preparedness begins with making yourself aware of what taken for granted expectations you have for your life. What are your unspoken assumptions? How do you envision the future and what it means to you? Could you imagine something that would greatly change the picture? Some kind of disaster, maybe a loss of ability would feel like a disaster, or loss of loved ones, or illness. And what meaning would you maintain, and what would fall away if that were to happen? In this case, the disaster is zombies. The spiritual disaster occurs in the gulf between what you were assuming your world would be like and what it really turns out to be. And here the show itself is instructive. Religion pops up a lot in this show, The Walking Dead. There's Herschel, an old homesteader who's holding on to his old-time religion and his power as patriarch. He's a moral purist, unwilling to let go of the standards of conduct that have defined him all his life. He still reads his Bible, and he searches it for clues about how to interpret the zombie takeover. But eventually, it's clear that what he's really going on is the classic leap of faith. He cannot personally see the meaning in what is happening, but he holds on with all his might to the idea that it's God's will and that it will make sense in the end. The thing about a leap of faith is either you've got it or you don't. You cannot will yourself to make it. Not really. We can't force ourselves to believe something that doesn't ring true in our hearts. If you grew up in another kind of church, it's possible that you experienced this firsthand at some point. Maybe you felt really bad about it, but you just couldn't make yourself believe. There's also more than one scene that takes place in a church in the show. In one, the main protagonist, Rick, enters a Southern Baptist church to find zombies sitting in the pews, staring at an enormous crucifix on the wall. So he destroys them and takes a seat himself, and he starts to pray out loud, looking up at that crucifix. He says, "I don't know if you're looking at me with what? Sadness? Scorn? Pity? Love? Maybe just indifference?" He says, "I guess I just chose to put my faith elsewhere. My family, my friends, my job. The thing is, we could use a little help to keep us going, some kind of acknowledgement, some indication that I'm doing the right thing. Hey, look, I don't need all the answers," he says. "Just a little nod, a sign. Any sign will do." A few minutes later, his young son gets shot. That's saying something. But is it nihilistic, right? Does this suggest that there's no God and no meaning in the show? Or doesn't it just press us to formulate a spirituality that makes more sense with the way things really happen in the world sometimes? Even the Bible has a story that's kind of like that. There are no zombies, despite the irony of Mel Gibson and George Romero, but in the book of Job, countless terrible things befall a man, even as he tries his hardest to be a good and religiously devout person. By the way, a crucifix on a wall in a Southern Baptist church could only be a Hollywood prop. Baptist churches do not have crucifixes, which are images of Jesus hanging on the cross. They don't have them because they think it's misguided to show Jesus still on the cross when the Gospels culminate not in his death but in his resurrection. So they stick with bare crosses instead to make the point that he's no longer there. That's your bit of religious trivia for the day. Obviously, in a massive disaster, people who've been sheltered from harsh realities or who have explained them away have to come to terms with tremendous suffering and chaos. In the show, most people are losing their religion. So I wonder, how would Unitarian Universalism fare? Could our religion survive the zombie apocalypse? Consider the challenges. Here's your top 7 list for the morning. First, a feeling that there's an absence of God. If you believed in it before, it would be hard to maintain it, perhaps, in the face of all that suffering. Next, it follows, to whom or to what are we accountable if there's no God, right? There's the constant threat of death, and with it, a prolonged state of fear. In the zombie apocalypse, things would get pretty bad. It would be a dog-eat-dog world, and you would feel that human nature perhaps had been revealed finally. There would be feelings of hopelessness, and with that, a sense of meaninglessness. These are not just hypothetical kinds of challenges, right? These don't only happen when zombies attack. We can come face to face with the threat of death anytime. A near miss in traffic, a terminal diagnosis, even thinking about these things can put us in that mind place, at least temporarily. We see the worst of human nature on the news all the time. Just look at the past week. And what is a midlife crisis but a head-on collision with questions of meaning and meaninglessness, right? Friends, this is what your ministers do in our spare time. We go around looking at things like zombies and thinking, that'll preach. You know, really, all of those 7 things, they really go back to the question of meaning. If you believe in God and you're suddenly confronted by a profound sense of God's absence, what meaning is left there? If you could die at any moment, meaning is urgent. If you don't have a mature spiritual grounding in meaning and you find yourself in a prolonged state of fear, it's going to be very difficult to think and to be and to reflect enough to get yourself there. And through meaning, we find hope. Not hope in the sense of feeling optimistic that we can get what we want. Hope in the sense of a deep inner orientation toward life. Like the poet Emily Dickinson must have been imagining when she wrote, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without the words and never stops at all." When we have a sense of meaning, we're oriented toward that, and it gives us hope. And it allows us to feel, as the gospel singer says, that it is well with my soul. The Unitarian Universalist humanist minister William Murray writes that the meaning of life is not a question with one big answer, but with many little answers. We don't eat one big meal and expect never to have to eat again. So we should not look for one big meaning to life, which, once discovered, will satisfy us for the rest of our lives. Some of us believe in something we would call God, some do not. But one thing that Unitarian Universalists have in common is that whatever the take on God, we have what you might call a horizontal kind of a theology. Those of us who believe in God tend to think of God as being in the world in one way or another, rather than removed from it, like a father observing his kids from up on a balcony. We see God in or through each other. A namaste kind of theology. Namaste comes from the Hindu tradition, and it's a greeting that means the sacred in me bows to the sacred in you. A liberal Christian way of expressing it is to say that we are God's hands and feet, and that God acts through us and is in us, suffering with us, hoping with us, not apart. Atheist or humanist UUs speak not of God, but of ultimate meaning being located in relationship, in that same horizontal plane. When we leave our lives, what remains is the love we shared with others through family, friends, and service to our fellow people. I polled some of my colleagues about what hymn to open with today, and one of them suggested a hymn called, I kid you not, I Cannot Think of Them as Dead. This is in our hymnal. But consider the words to it. I cannot think of them as dead who walk with me no more. Along the path of life I tread, they are but gone before. They are but gone before. And still their silent ministry within my heart has place, as when on earth they walked with me and met me face to face, and met me face to face. Mine are they by an ownership nor time nor death can free, for God has given love to keep its own eternally, its own eternally. Whether you think love comes from God or was an amazing byproduct of the Big Bang, or whether you think those two concepts are the same dang thing, we can appreciate the deep truth in the hymnist's words that love does not end in death or disaster. Love transcends the vicissitudes and the misfortunes of this world. I'm not talking about romantic love, although that is sometimes part of it. I'm talking about soulful, connected with something larger than yourself love. Love with a capital L. Do you have it? Have you thought about how to express it through your life? If you came into church today with some measure of cynicism in you, or if you're angry for some reason, then this notion might sound cheesy. But I'm telling you, when all is said and done, love with a capital L is what grounds us, and it is one of the biggest things that gives our lives meaning. But it does so, as Murray suggests, in 1,000 little answers. One of the answers comes in the forms of congregations like this one. When we are in a prolonged state of fear or anger or cynicism or sadness, it can be very hard to cultivate the kind of presence we need, the kind of attention to the present that opens us up to love and meaning and hope. In those times, when we're in too much of a state of crisis to keep grounded in our own faith, that is when you can rest in the faith of this gathered community. Collectively, the hundreds of people who are part of this congregation, including you and me, have experienced untold losses and traumas, disappointments and personal failures, things that happen quickly, out of nowhere, and disasters that ripen slowly over a generation or more. And we have somehow come through them, or we're coming through them, and we're learning to live meaningful lives through them. And so we possess together a collective wisdom about the role these things play in a human life, that we are more than our disasters, that humankind is more than its worst expressions. And out of that wisdom, we take up this religious community that we've inherited from people who came before us. We continue their work of creating it every day by showing up, by bringing our whole selves to it, by supporting it, so that when needed, we and others can rest in the faith of the gathered community that knows love, meaning, and hope. Not naive hope, but hope that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. In the show, as the band of protagonists wanders around fighting off zombies and other less friendly humans, they develop a deep sense of community. They grow as individuals. People who were lonely become members of a family. People who were weak become warriors. The world they are in might seem nothing but hostile, but in fact there is still something kind and something meaningful in it for them. This made me think of a reading by Victoria Safford, who tells a story about a friend of hers who is going through a divorce and all of the grief and collateral damage that goes with that. One day he received a profoundly kind, anonymous note out of the blue. The experience reminded him of words from the Song of the Bird, from the Ojibwe tradition. Sometimes I go about in pity for myself, and all the while the wind is bearing me across the sky. Maybe this is why the Walking Dead comic book, which is what the TV series is based on, first paints a picture of the catastrophe. It says, the world of commerce and frivolous necessity has been replaced by a world of survival and responsibility. An epidemic of apocalyptic proportions has swept the globe, causing the dead to rise and feed on the living. In a matter of months, society has crumbled. No government, no grocery stores, no mail delivery, no cable TV. And then it says this, in a world ruled by the dead, we are forced to finally start living. My fellow minister, Tom Belote, who also saw zombies and thought, that'll preach, says, people in The Walking Dead aren't afraid of dying as much as they are afraid of becoming zombies, not living our lives, being mindless. Zombies are never satisfied. They eat, and they are still hungry. Unitarian Universalism isn't one big, fast spiritual meal that will keep you satisfied for life the moment you eat it. It's slow food, small plates, family style. But it is deeply nourishing. It is satisfying. And come the zombie apocalypse, or just life, it is a provision that will serve you well. Nevertheless, it is well to pray that our faith isn't tested anytime soon, and so please rise as you are able and join me in singing our closing hymn, number 1 in your hymnal, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door.